This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Warlords of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the south shores of Lake Superior. Chapter 12. Follow the Rope. What could it mean, follow the rope? What rope? Presently I recalled the cord that had been attached to the parcel when it fell at my side, and after a little groping my hand came in contact with it again. It depended from above, and when I pulled upon it I discovered that it was rigidly fastened, possibly at the pit's mouth. Upon examination I found that the cord, though small, was amply able to sustain the weight of several men. Then I made another discovery. There was a second message knotted in the rope at about the height of my head. This I deciphered more easily, now that the key was mine. Bring the rope with you. Beyond the knot lies danger. That was all there was to this message. It was evidently hastily formed, an afterthought. I did not pause longer than to learn the contents of the second message, and, though I was none too sure of the meaning of the final admonition, beyond the knot lies danger, yet I was sure that here before me lay an avenue of escape, and that the sooner I took advantage of it, the more likely was I to win to liberty. At least I could be but little worse off than I had been in the pit of plenty. I was to find, however, ere I was well out of that damnable hole, that I might have been very much worse off had I been compelled to remain there another 2 minutes. It had taken me about that length of time to ascend some 50 feet above the bottom, when a noise above attracted my attention. To my chagrin, I saw that the covering of the pit was being removed far above me, and in the light of the courtyard beyond I saw a number of yellow warriors. Could it be that I was laboriously working my way into some new trap? Were the messages spurious after all? And then, just as my hope and courage had ebbed to their lowest, I saw two things. One was the body of a huge, struggling, snarling ape being lowered over the side of the pit toward me, and the other was an aperture in the side of the shaft, an aperture larger than a man's body, into which my rope led. Just as I scrambled into the dark hole before me, the ape passed me, reaching out with his mighty hands to clutch me, and snapping, growling, and roaring in a most frightful manner. Plainly now I saw the end for which Silence's Owl had destined me. After first torturing me with starvation, he had caused this fierce beast to be lowered into my prison to finish the work that the Jedic's hellish imagination had conceived. And then another truth flashed upon me. I had lived 9 days of the allotted 10 which must intervene before Silence's Owl could make Dejah Thoris his queen. The purpose of the ape was to ensure my death before the 10th day. I almost laughed aloud as I thought how Silence's Owl's measure of safety was to aid in defeating the very end he sought. For when they discovered that the ape was alone in the pit of plenty, they could not know but that he had completely devoured me, and so no suspicion of my escape would cause a search to be made for me. Coiling the rope that had carried me thus far upon my strange journey, I sought for the other end, but found that as I followed it forward, it extended always before me. So this was the meaning of the words, "Follow the rope." The tunnel through which I crawled was low and dark. I had followed it for several hundred yards when I felt a knot beneath my fingers. Beyond the knots lies danger. Now I went with the utmost caution, and a moment later a sharp turn in the tunnel brought me to an opening into a large, brilliantly lighted chamber. The trend of the tunnel I had been traversing had been slightly upward, and from this I judged that the chamber into which I now found myself looking must be either on the first floor of the palace or directly beneath the first floor. Upon the opposite wall were many strange instruments and devices, and in the center of the room stood a long table, at which 2 men were seated in earnest conversation. He who faced me was a yellow man, a little, wizened-up, pasty-faced old fellow with great eyes that showed the white round the entire circumference of the iris. His companion was a black man, and I did not need to see his face to know that it was Thurid, for there was no other of the firstborn north of the ice barrier. Thurid was speaking as I came within hearing of the men's voices. "Solan," he was saying, "there is no risk, and the reward is great. You know that you hate Silence's Owl, and that nothing would please you more than to thwart him in some cherished plan. There be nothing that he more cherishes today than the idea of wedding the beautiful Princess of Helium. But I, too, want her, and with your help I may win her. You need not more than step from this room for an instant when I give you the signal. I will do the rest, and then, when I am gone, you may come and throw the great switch back into its place, and all will be as before. I need but an hour's start to be safe beyond the devilish power that you control in this hidden chamber beneath the palace of your master. See how easy?" And with the words the Black Dator rose from his seat, and crossing the room, laid his hand upon a large burnished lever that protruded from the opposite wall. "No, no!" cried the little old man, springing after him, with a wild shriek. "Not that one! Not that one! That controls the sunray tanks, and should you pull it too far down, all Cadabra would be consumed by heat before I could replace it. Come away, come away! You know not with what mighty powers you play. This is the lever that you seek. Note well the symbol inlaid in white upon its ebon surface." Theward approached and examined the handle of the lever. "Ah, a magnet," he said. "I will remember. It is settled then, I take it," he continued. The old man hesitated. A look of combined greed and apprehension overspread his none too beautiful features. "Double the figure," he said. "Even that were all too small an amount for the service you ask. Why, I risk my life by even entertaining you here within the forbidden precincts of my station. Should Silensis Ol learn of it, he would have me thrown to the apse before the day was done." "He dare not do that, and you know it full well, Solon," contradicted the black. "Too great a power of life and death you hold over the people of Cadabra for Silensis Ol ever to risk threatening you with death. Before ever his minions could lay their hands upon you, you might seize this very lever from which you have just warned me, and wipe out the entire city." "And myself into the bargain," said Solon, with a shudder. "But if you were to die anyway, you would find the nerve to do it," replied Theward. "Yes," muttered Solon, "I have often thought upon that very thing. Well, firstborn, is your red princess worth the price I ask for my services, or will you go without her and see her in the arms of Silensis Ol tomorrow night?" "Take your price, yellow man," replied Theward with an oath. "Half now, and the balance when you have fulfilled your contract." With that the Dator threw a well-filled money pouch upon the table. Solon opened the pouch, and with trembling fingers counted its contents. His weird eyes assumed a greedy expression, and his unkempt beard and mustache twitched with the muscles of his mouth and chin. It was quite evident from his very mannerism that Theward had keenly guessed the man's weakness. Even the claw-like, clutching movement of the fingers betokened the avariciousness of the miser. Having satisfied himself that the amount was correct, Solon replaced the money in the pouch and rose from the table. "Now," he said, "are you quite sure that you know the way to your destination? You must travel quickly to cover the ground to the cave, and from thence beyond the great power. All within a brief hour, for no more dare I spare you." "Let me repeat it to you," said Theward, "that you may see if I be letter perfect." "Proceed," replied Solon. "Through the yonder door," he commenced, pointing to a door at the far end of the apartment, "I follow a corridor, passing 3 diverging corridors upon my right. Then into the 4th right-hand corridor, straight to where 3 corridors meet. Here again I follow to the right, hugging the left wall closely to avoid the pit. At the end of this corridor I shall come to a spiraled runway, which I must follow down instead of up. After that the way is along but a single branchless corridor. Am I right?" "Quite right, Dator," answered Solon, "and now be gone. Already have you tempted fate too long within this forbidden place." "Tonight or tomorrow, then, you may expect the signal," said Theward, rising to go. "Tonight or tomorrow," repeated Solon, and as the door closed behind his guest, the old man continued to mutter as he turned back to the table, where he again dumped the contents of the money pouch, running his fingers through the heap of shining metal, piling the coins into little towers, counting, recounting, and fondling the wealth the while he muttered on and on in a croning undertone. Presently his fingers ceased their play. His eyes popped wider than ever as they fastened upon the door through which Theward had disappeared. The croon changed to a querulous muttering, and finally to an ugly growl. Then the old man rose from the table, shaking his fist at the closed door.
Now he raised his voice, and his words came distinctly. "Fool," he muttered, "think you that for your happiness Solon will give up his life? If you escaped, Silence's Ol would know that only through my connivance could you have succeeded. Then would he send for me. What would you have me do? Reduce the city and myself to ashes? No, fool, there is a better way for Solon to keep thy money and be revenged upon Silence's Ol." He laughed in a nasty cackling note. "Poor fool! You may throw the great switch that will give you the freedom of the heir of Okar, and then, in fatuous security, go on with thy red princess to the freedom of death. When you have passed beyond this chamber into your flight, what can prevent Solon replacing the switch as it was before your vile hand touched it? Nothing. And then the guardian of the north will claim you and your woman, and Silence's Ol, when he sees your dead bodies, will never dream that the hand of Solon had aught to do with the thing." Then his voice dropped once more into mutterings that I could not translate, but I had heard enough to cause me to guess a great deal more, and I thanked the kind Providence that had led me to this chamber at a time so filled with importance to Dejah Thoris and myself as this. But how to pass the old man now? The cord, almost invisible upon the floor, stretched straight across the apartment to a door upon the far side. There was no other way of which I knew, nor could I afford to ignore the advice to follow the rope. I must cross this room, but however I should accomplish it, undetected with that old man in the very center of it, baffled me. Of course I might have sprung in upon him, and with my bare hands silenced him forever. But I had heard enough to convince me that with him alive the knowledge that I had gained might serve me at some future moment, while should I kill him, and another be stationed in his place, Thuard would not come hither with Dejah Thoris, as was quite evidently his intention. As I stood in the dark shadow of the tunnel's end, racking my brain for a feasible plan, that while I watched, cat-like, the old man's every move, he took up the money pouch and crossed to one end of the apartment, where, bending to his knees, he fumbled with a panel in the wall. Instantly I guessed that here was the hiding place in which he hoarded his wealth, and while he bent there, his back toward me, I entered the chamber upon tiptoe, and with the utmost stealth essayed to reach the opposite side before he should complete his task and turn again toward the room's center. Scarcely 30 steps, all told, must I take, and yet it seemed to my overwrought imagination that farther wall was miles away. But at last I reached it, nor once had I taken my eyes from the back of the old miser's head. He did not turn until my hand was upon the button that controlled the door through which my way led, and then he turned away from me as I passed through and gently closed the door. For an instant I paused, my ear close to the panel, to learn if he had suspected aught, but as no sound of pursuit came from within, I wheeled and made my way along the new corridor, following the rope, which I coiled and brought with me as I advanced. But a short distance farther on I came to the rope's end, at a point where 5 corridors met. What was I to do? Which way should I turn? I was nonplussed. A careful examination of the end of the rope revealed the fact that it had been cleanly cut with some sharp instrument. This fact, and the words that had cautioned me that danger lay beyond the knots, convinced me that the rope had been severed since my friend had placed it as my guide, for I had but passed a single knot, whereas there had evidently been 2 or more in the entire length of the cord. Now indeed was I in a pretty fix, for neither did I know which avenue to follow, nor when danger lay directly in my path. But there was nothing else to be done than follow one of the corridors, for I could gain nothing by remaining where I was. So I chose the central opening, and passed on into its gloomy depths with a prayer upon my lips. The floor of the tunnel rose rapidly as I advanced, and a moment later the way came to an abrupt end before a heavy door. I could hear nothing beyond, and, with my accustomed rashness, pushed the portal wide to step into a room filled with yellow warriors. The first to see me opened his eyes wide in astonishment, and at the same instant I felt the tingling sensation in my finger that denoted the presence of a friend of the ring. Then others saw me, and there was a concerted rush to lay hands upon me, for these were all members of the palace guard, men familiar with my face. The first to reach me was the wearer of the mate to my strange ring, and as he came close he whispered, "Surrender to me," then in a loud voice shouted, "You are my prisoner, white man," and menaced me with his 2 weapons. And so John Carter, Prince of Helium, meekly surrendered to a single antagonist. The others now swarmed about us, asking many questions, but I would not talk to them, and finally my captor announced that he would lead me back to my cell. An officer ordered several other warriors to accompany him, and a moment later we were retracing the way that I had just come. My friend walked close beside me, asking many silly questions about the country from which I had come, until finally his fellows paid no further attention to him or his gabbling. Gradually, as he spoke, he lowered his voice, so that presently he was able to converse with me in a low tone without attracting attention. His ruse was a clever one, and showed that Talul had not misjudged the man's fitness for the dangerous duty upon which he was detailed. When he had fully assured himself that the other guardsmen were not listening, he asked me why I had not followed the rope, and when I had told him that it had ended at the 5 corridors, he said that it must have been cut by someone in need of a piece of rope, for he was sure that the stupid Cadabrans would never have guessed its purpose. Before we had reached the spot from which the 5 corridors diverged, my Martian friend had managed to drop to the rear of the little column with me, and when we came in sight of the branching ways, he whispered, "Run up the first upon the right. It leads to the watchtower upon the south wall. I will direct the pursuit up the next corridor." And with that he gave me a great shove into the dark mouth of the tunnel, at the same time crying out in simulated pain and alarm as he threw himself upon the floor as though I had felled him with a blow. From behind, the voices of the excited guardsmen came reverberating along the corridor, suddenly growing fainter as Talul's spy led them up the wrong passageway in fancied pursuit. As I ran for my life through the dark galleries beneath the palace of Silensis Ol, I must indeed have presented a remarkable appearance, had there been any to note it. For though death loomed large about me, my face was split by a broad grin as I thought of the resourcefulness of the nameless hero of Marantina to whom I owed my life. Of such stuff are the men of my beloved Helium, and when I meet another of their kind, of whatever race or color, my heart goes out to him as it did now to my new friend who had risked his life for me simply because I wore the mate to the ring his ruler had put upon his finger. The corridor along which I ran led almost straight for a considerable distance, terminating at the foot of a spiral runway, up which I proceeded to emerge presently into a circular chamber upon the first floor of a tower. In this apartment a dozen red slaves were employed polishing or repairing the weapons of the yellow men. The walls of the room were lined with racks in which were hundreds of straight or hooked swords, javelins, and daggers. It was evidently an armory. There were but 3 warriors guarding the workers. My eyes took in the entire scene at a glance. Here were weapons in plenty. Here were sinewy red warriors to wield them. And here now was John Carter, Prince of Helium, in need both of weapons and warriors. As I stepped into the apartment, guards and prisoners saw me simultaneously. Close to the entrance where I stood was a rack of straight swords, and as my hand closed upon the hilt of one of them, my eyes fell upon the faces of 2 of the prisoners who worked side by side. One of the guards started toward me. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What do you here?" "I come for Tardos Mors, Jeddak of Helium and his son Mors Kajak," I cried, pointing to the 2 red prisoners, who had now sprung to their feet, wide-eyed in astonished recognition. "Rise, red man. Before we die, let us leave a memorial in the palace of Okar's tyrant that will stand forever in the annals of Cadabra, to the honor and glory of Helium." For I had seen that all the prisoners there were men of Tardos Mors' navy. Then the first guardsman was upon me, and the fight was on. But scarce did we engage ere, to my horror, I saw that the red slaves were shackled to the floor. End of Chapter 12.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Warlords of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the south shores of Lake Superior.
Chapter 13. The Magnet Switch. The guardsmen paid not the slightest attention to their wards, for the red men could not move over 2 feet from the great rings to which they were padlocked, though each had seized a weapon upon which he had been engaged when I entered the room, and stood ready to join me could they have but done so. The yellow men devoted all their attention to me, nor were they long in discovering that the 3 of them were none too many to defend the armory against John Carter. Would that I had had my own good longsword in my hand that day, but, as it was, I rendered a satisfactory account of myself with the unfamiliar weapon of the yellow men. At first I had a time of it, dodging their villainous hook swords, but after a minute or 2 I had succeeded in wresting a second straight sword from one of the racks along the wall, and thereafter, using it to parry the hooks of my antagonists, I felt more evenly equipped. The 3 of them were on me at once, and but for a lucky circumstance my end might have come quickly. The foremost guardsman made a vicious lunge for my side with his hook after the 3 of them had backed me against the wall, but as I sidestepped and raised my arm, his weapon but grazed my side, passing into a rack of javelins, where it became entangled. Before he could release it, I had run him through, and then, falling back upon the tactics that have saved me 100 times in tight pinches, I rushed the 2 remaining warriors, forcing them back with a perfect torrent of cuts and thrusts, weaving my sword in and out about their guards until I had the fear of death upon them. Then one of them commenced calling for help, but it was too late to save them. They were as putty in my hands now, and I backed them about the armory as I would until I had them where I wanted them, within reach of the swords of the shackled slaves. In an instant both lay dead upon the floor, but their cries had not been entirely fruitless, for now I heard answering shouts and the footfalls of many men running and the clank of accoutrements and the commands of officers. "The door! Quick, John Carter! Bar the door!" cried Tardos Morse. Already the guard was in sight, charging across the open court that was visible through the doorway. A dozen seconds would bring them into the tower. A single leap carried me to the heavy portal. With a resounding bang I slammed it shut. "The bar!" shouted Tardos Morse. I tried to slip the huge fastening into place, but it defied my every attempt. "Raise it a little to release the catch," cried one of the red men. I could hear the yellow warriors leaping along the flagging just beyond the door. I raised the bar and shot it to the right just as the foremost of the guardsmen threw himself against the opposite side of the massive panels. The barrier held. I had been in time, but by the fraction of a second only. Now I turned my attention to the prisoners. To Tardos Morse I went first, asking where the keys might be which would unfasten their fetters. "The officer of the guard has them," replied the Jeddak of Helium, "and he is among those without who seek entrance. You will have to force them." Most of the prisoners were already hacking at their bonds with the swords in their hands. The yellow men were battering at the door with javelins and axes. I turned my attention to the chains that held Tardos Morse. Again and again I cut deep into the metal with my sharp blade, but ever faster and faster fell the torrent of blows upon the portal. At last a link parted beneath my efforts, and a moment later Tardos Morse was free, though a few inches of trailing chain still dangled from his ankle. A splinter of wood falling inward from the door announced the headway that our enemies were making toward us. The mighty panels trembled and bent beneath the furious onslaught of the enraged yellow men. What with the battering upon the door and the hacking of the red men at their chains, the din within the armory was appalling. No sooner was Tardos Morse free than he turned his attention to another of the prisoners, while I set to work to liberate Morse Kajak. We must work fast if we would have all those fetters cut before the door gave way. Now a panel crashed inward upon the floor, and Morse Kajak sprang to the opening to defend the way until we should have time to release the others. With javelins snatched from the wall he wrought havoc among the foremost of the Alcarians, while we battled with the insensate metal that stood between our fellows and freedom. At length all but one of the prisoners were freed, and then the door fell with a mighty crash before a hastily improvised battering ram, and the yellow horde was upon us. "To the upper chambers!" shouted the red men, who was still fettered to the floor. "To the upper chambers! There you may defend the tower against all Cadabra. Do not delay because of me, who could pray for no better death than in the service of Tardos Mors and the Prince of Helium. But I would have sacrificed the life of every man of us rather than desert a single redman, much less the lion-hearted hero who begged us to leave him. Cut his chains, I cried to 2 of the redmen, while the balance of us hold off the foe. There were 10 of us now to do battle with the Ocarian guard, and I warrant that ancient watchtower never looked down upon a more hotly contested battle than took place that day within its own grim walls. The first inrushing wave of yellow warriors recoiled from the slashing blades of 10 of Helium's veteran fighting men. A dozen Ocarian corpses blocked the doorway, but over the gruesome barrier a score more of their fellows dashed, shouting their hoarse and hideous war-cry. Upon the bloody mound we met them, hand to hand, stabbing where the quarters were too close to cut, thrusting when we could push a foeman to arm's length, and mingled with the wild cry of the Ocarian, there rose and fell the glorious words, "For Helium! For Helium!" that for countless ages have spurred on the bravest of the brave to those deeds of valor that have sent the fame of Helium's heroes broadcast throughout the length and breadth of a world. Now were the fetters struck from the last of the red men, and 13 strong we met each new charge of the soldiers of Silensis Ol. Scarce one of us but bled from a score of wounds, yet none had fallen. From without we saw hundreds of guardsmen pouring into the courtyard, and along the lower corridor from which I had found my way to the armory we could hear the clank of metal and the shouting of men. In a moment we should be attacked from 2 sides, and with all our prowess we could not hope to withstand the unequal odds which would thus divide our attention and our small numbers. "To the upper chambers!" cried Tardos Mors, and a moment later we fell back toward the runway that led to the floors above. Here another bloody battle was waged with the force of yellow men who charged into the armory as we fell back from the doorway. Here we lost our first man, a noble fellow whom we could ill spare, but at length all had backed into the runway except myself, who remained to hold back the Ocarian until the others were safe above. In the mouth of the narrow spiral but a single warrior could attack me at a time, so that I had little difficulty in holding them all back for the brief moment that was necessary. Then, backing slowly before them, I commenced the ascent of the spiral. All the long way to the tower's top the guardsmen pressed me closely. When one went down before my sword, another scrambled over the dead man to take his place, and thus, taking an awful toll with each few feet gained, I came to the spacious glass-walled watchtower of Cadabra. Here my companions clustered ready to take my place, and for a moment's respite I stepped to one side, while they held the enemy off. From the lofty perch a view could be had for miles in every direction. Toward the south stretched the rugged, ice-clad waste to the edge of the mighty barrier. Toward the east and west, and dimly toward the north, I descried other Ocarian cities, while in the immediate foreground, just beyond the walls of Cadabra, the grim guardian shaft reared its somber head. Then I cast my eyes down into the streets of Cadabra, from which a sudden tumult had arisen, and there I saw a battle raging, and beyond the city's walls I saw armed men marching in great columns towards a nearby gate. Eagerly I pressed forward against the glass wall of the observatory, scarce daring to credit the testimony of my own eyes. But at last I could doubt no longer, and with a shout of joy that rose strangely in the midst of the cursing and groaning of the battling men at the entrance to the chamber, I called to Tardos Mors. As he joined me, I pointed down into the streets of Cadabra, and to the advancing columns beyond, above which floated bravely in the arctic air the flags and banners of Helium. An instant later every red man in the lofty chamber had seen the inspiring sight, and such a shout of thanksgiving arose as I warrant never before echoed through the age-old pile of stone. But still we must fight on, for though our troops had entered Cadabra, the city was yet far from capitulation, nor had the palace been ever assaulted. Turn and turn about we held the top of the runway, while the others feasted their eyes upon the sight of our valiant countrymen battling far beneath us. Now they have rushed the palace gate. Great battering rams are dashed against its formidable surface. Now they are repulsed by a deadly shower of javelins from the wall's top. Once again they charge. but a sortie by a large force of Okarians from an intersecting avenue crumples the head of the column, and the men of Helium go down, fighting, beneath an overwhelming force. The palace gate flies open, and a force of the Jedic's own guard, picked men from the flower of the Okarian army, sallies forth to shatter the broken regiments. For a moment it looks as though nothing could avert defeat, and then I see a noble figure upon a mighty thoat, not the tiny thoat of the red men, but one of his huge cousins of the Dead Sea bottoms. The warrior hews his way to the front, and behind him rally the disorganized soldiers of Helium. As he raises his head aloft to fling a challenge at the men upon the palace walls, I see his face, and my heart swells in pride and happiness as the red warriors leap to the side of their leader and win back the ground that they had but just lost. The face of him upon the mighty thoat is the face of my son, Carthoris of Helium. At his side fights a huge Martian war-hound, nor did I need a second look to know that it was Wula, my faithful Wula, who had thus well performed his arduous task and brought the succoring legions in the nick of time. In the nick of time? Who yet might say that they were not too late to save, but surely they could avenge, and such retribution as that unconquered army would deal out to the hateful Okarians. I sighed to think that I might not be alive to witness it. Again I turned to the windows. The red men had not yet forced the outer palace wall, but they were fighting nobly against the best that Okar afforded, valiant warriors who contested every inch of the way. Now my attention was caught by a new element without the city wall, a great body of mounted warriors looming large above the red men. They were the huge green allies of Helium, the savage hordes from the Dead Sea bottoms of the far south. In grim and terrible silence they sped on toward the gate, the padded hooves of their frightful mounts giving forth no sound. Into the doomed city they charged, and as they wheeled across the wide plaza before the palace of the Jedic of Jedics, I saw, riding at their head, the mighty figure of their mighty leader, Tars Tarkas, Jedic of Thark. My wish, then, was to be gratified, for I was to see my old friend battling once again, and though not shoulder to shoulder with him, I too would be fighting in the same cause here in the high tower of Okar. Nor did it seem that our foes would ever cease their stubborn attacks, for still they came, though the way to our chamber was often clogged with the bodies of their dead. At times they would pause long enough to drag back the impeding corpses, and then fresh warriors would forge upward to taste the cup of death. I had been taking my turn with the others in defending the approach of our lofty retreat, when Mors Kajak, who had been watching the battle in the street below, called aloud in sudden excitement. There was a note of apprehension in his voice that brought me to his side the instant that I could turn my place over to another. And as I reached him, he pointed far out across the waste of snow and ice toward the southern horizon. "Alas," he cried, "that I should be forced to witness cruel fate betray them without power to warn or aid. But they be past either now." As I looked in the direction he indicated, I saw the cause of his perturbation. A mighty fleet of flyers was approaching majestically toward Kadabra from the direction of the ice barrier. On and on they came with ever-increasing velocity. "The grim shaft that they call the Guardian of the North is beckoning to them," said Mors Kajak sadly, "just as it beckoned to Tardos Mors and his great fleet. See where they lay, crumpled and broken, a grim and terrible monument to the mighty force of destruction which naught can resist." I too saw, but something else I saw that Mors Kajak did not. In my mind's eye I saw a buried chamber whose walls were lined with strange instruments and devices. In the center of the chamber was a long table, and before it sat a little pop-eyed old man counting his money. But plainest of all, I saw upon the wall a great switch with a small magnet inlaid within the surface of its black handle. Then I glanced out at the fast-approaching fleet. In 5 minutes that mighty armada of the skies would be bent and worthless scrap, laying at the base of the shaft beyond the city's wall, and yellow hordes would be loosed from another gate to rush out upon the few survivors, stumbling blindly down through the mass of wreckage. Then the apse would come. I shuddered at the thought, for I could vividly picture the whole horrible scene. Quick have I always been to decide and act. The impulse that moves me and the doing of the thing seem simultaneous. For if my mind goes through the tedious formality of reasoning, it must be a subconscious act of which I am not objectively aware. Psychologists tell me that, as the subconscious does not reason, too close a scrutiny of my mental activities might prove anything but flattering, but be that as it may, I have often won success while the thinker would have been still at the endless task of comparing various judgments. And now celerity of action was the prime essential to the success of the thing that I had decided upon. Grasping my sword more firmly in my hand, I called to the red men at the opening to the runway to stand aside. "Way for the Prince of Helium!" I shouted, and before the astonished yellow men, whose misfortune it was to be at the fighting end of the line at that particular moment, could gather his wits together, my sword had decapitated him, and I was rushing like a mad bull down upon those behind him. "Way for the Prince of Helium!" I shouted as I cut a path through the astonished guardsmen of Silencis Ol. Hewing to right and left, I beat my way down that warrior-choked spiral until, near the bottom, those below, thinking that an army was descending upon them, turned and fled. The armory at the first floor was vacant when I entered it, the last of the Okarian having fled into the courtyard, so none saw me continue down the spiral toward the corridor beneath. Here I ran as rapidly as my legs would carry me toward the 5 corners, and there plunged into the passageway that led to the station of the old miser. Without the formality of a knock, I burst into the room. There sat the old man at his table, but as he saw me he sprung to his feet, drawing his sword. With scarce more than a glance toward him, I leaped for the great switch, but quick as I was, that wiry old fellow was there before me. How he did it I shall never know, nor does it seem credible that any Martian-born creature could approximate the marvelous speed of my earthly muscles. Like a tiger he turned upon me, and I was quick to see why Solon had been chosen for this important duty. Never in all my life have I seen such wondrous swordsmanship, and such uncanny agility as that ancient bag of bones displayed. He was in 40 places at the same time, and before I had half a chance to awaken to my danger, he was like to have made a monkey of me, and a dead monkey at that. It is strange how new and unexpected conditions bring out unguessed ability to meet them. That day in the buried chamber beneath the palace of Silencis Ol, I learned what swordsmanship meant, and to what heights of sword mastery I could achieve when pitted against such a wizard of the blade as Solon. For a time he liked to have bested me, but presently the latent possibilities that must have been lying dormant within me for a lifetime came to the fore. I fought as I had never dreamed a human being could fight. That duel royale should have taken place in the dark recesses of a cellar without a single appreciative eye to witness it has always seemed to me almost a world calamity, at least from the viewpoint of Barsoomian, where bloody strife is the first and greatest consideration of individuals, nations, and races. I was fighting to reach the switch, Solon to prevent me, and though we stood not 3 feet from it, I could not win an inch toward it, for he forced me back an inch for the first 5 minutes of our battle. I knew that if I were to throw it in time to save the oncoming fleet, it must be done in the next few seconds, and so I tried my old rushing tactics. But I might as well have rushed a brick wall for all that Solon gave way. In fact, I came near to impaling myself upon his point for my pains. But right was on my side, and I think that must give a man greater confidence than though he knew himself to be battling in a wicked cause. At least, I did not want in confidence, and when I next rushed Solon, it was to one side with implicit confidence that he must turn to meet my new line of attack, and turn he did. So now that we fought with our sides toward the coveted goal, the great switch stood within my reach upon my right hand. To uncover my breast for an instant would have been to court sudden death, but I saw no other way than to chance it, if by so doing I might rescue that oncoming succoring fleet. And so, in the face of a wicked sword thrust, I reached out my point and caught the great switch a sudden blow that released it from its seating. So surprised and horrified was Solon that he forgot to finish his thrust. Instead, he wheeled toward the switch with a loud shriek, a shriek which was his last, for before his hand could touch the lever it sought, my sword's point had passed through his heart. End of chapter 13.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Warlords of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the south shores of Lake Superior.
Chapter 14. The Tide of Battle. But Solon's last loud cry had not been without effect, for a moment later a dozen guardsmen burst into the chamber, though not before I had so bent and demolished the great switch that it could not be again used to turn the powerful current into the mighty magnet of destruction it controlled. The result of the sudden coming of the guardsmen had been to compel me to seek seclusion in the first passageway that I could find, and that, to my disappointment, proved to be not the one with which I was familiar, but another upon its left. They must have either heard or guessed which way I went, for I had proceeded but a short distance when I heard the sound of pursuit. I had no mind to stop and fight these men here, when there was fighting aplenty elsewhere in the city of Carabra, fighting that could be of much more avail to me and mine than useless life-taking far below the palace. But the fellows were pressing me, and as I did not know the way at all, I soon saw that they would overtake me unless I found a place to conceal myself until they had passed, which would then give me an opportunity to return the way I had come and regain the tower, or possibly find a way to reach the city streets. The passageway had risen rapidly since leaving the apartment of the switch, and now ran level and well lighted straight into the distance as far as I could see. The moment that my pursuers reached this straight stretch, I would be in plain sight of them, with no chance to escape from the corridor undetected. Presently I saw a series of doors opening from either side of the corridor, and as they all looked alike to me, I tried the first one that I reached. It opened into a small chamber, luxuriously furnished, and was evidently an antechamber off some office or audience chamber of the palace. On the far side was a heavily curtained doorway, beyond which I heard the hum of voices. Instantly I crossed the small chamber, and, parting the curtains, looked within the larger apartment. Before me were a party of perhaps 50 gorgeously clad nobles of the court, standing before a throne upon which sat Silensis Ol, the Jetic of Jetics, was addressing them. "The allotted hour has come," he was saying, as I entered the apartment, "and though the enemies of Okar be within her gates, naught may stay the will of Silensis Ol. The great ceremony must be omitted, that no single man may be kept from his place in the defenses other than the 50 that custom demands shall witness the creation of a new queen in Okar. In a moment the thing shall be have done, and we may return to the battle, while she who is now the Princess of Helium looks down from the Queen's Tower upon the annihilation of her former countrymen, and witnesses the greatness which is her husband's." Then, turning to a courier, he issued some command in a low voice. The addressed hastened to a small door at the far end of the chamber, and swinging it wide, cry, "Way for Dejah Thoris, future Queen of Okar." Immediately 2 guardsmen appeared dragging the unwilling bride toward the altar. Her hands were still manacled behind her, evidently to prevent suicide. Her dishevelled hair and panting bosom betokened that, chained though she was, still had she fought against the thing that they would do to her. At sight of her, Silensis Ol rose and drew his sword, and the sword of each of the 50 nobles were raised on high to form an arc, beneath which the poor, beautiful creature was dragged toward her doom. A grim smile forced itself to my lips as I thought of the rude awakening that lay in store for the ruler of Okar, and my itching fingers fondled the hilt of my bloody sword. As I watched the procession that moved slowly toward the throne, a procession which consisted of but a handful of priests who followed Dejah Thoris and the 2 guardsmen, I caught a fleeting glimpse of a black face peering from behind the draperies that covered the wall back of the dais upon which stood Silensis Ol awaiting his bride. Now the guardsmen were forcing the Princess of Helium up the few steps to the side of the tyrant of Okar, and I had no eyes and no thoughts for aught else. A priest opened a book, and raising his hand, commenced to drone out a single song ritual. Silensis Ol reached for the hand of his bride. I had intended waiting until some circumstance should give me a reasonable hope of success, for even though the entire ceremony should be completed, there could be no valid marriage while I lived. What I was most concerned in, of course, was the rescuing of Dejah Thoris. I wished to take her from the palace of Silensis Ol, if such a thing were possible, but whether it were accomplished before or after the mock marriage was a matter of secondary import. When, however, I saw the vile hand of Silensis Ol reach out for the hand of my beloved princess, I could restrain myself no longer, and before the nobles of Okar knew that aught had happened, I had leaped through their thin line and was upon the dais before Dejah Thoris and Silensis Ol. With the flat of my sword I struck down his polluting hand, and grasping Dejah Thoris round the waist, I swung her behind me as with my back against the draperies of the dais. I faced the tyrant of the north, and his roomful of noble warriors. The Jeddak of Jeddaks was a great mountain of a man, a coarse, brutal beast of a man, and as he towered above me there, his fierce black whiskers and mustache bristling in rage, I can well imagine that a less seasoned warrior might have trembled before him. With a snarl he sprang toward me with naked sword, but whether Silensis Ol was a good swordsman or a poor I never learned, for with Dejah Thoris at my back I was no longer human, I was a superman, and no man could have withstood me then. With a single blow for the Princess of Helium, I ran my blade straight through the rotten heart of Okar's rotten ruler, and before the white, drawn faces of his nobles, Silensis Ol rolled, grinning in horrible death, to the foot of the steps below his marriage throne. For a moment tense silence reigned in the nuptial room. Then the 50 nobles rushed upon me. Furiously we fought, but the advantage was mine, for I stood upon a raised platform above them, and I fought for the most glorious woman of a glorious race, and I fought for a great love and for the mother of my boy. And from behind my shoulder, in the silvery cadence of that dear voice, rose the brave battle anthem of Helium which the nation's women sing as their men march out to victory. That alone was enough to inspire me to victory over even greater odds, and I verily believe that I should have bested the entire roomful of yellow warriors that day in the nuptial chamber of the palace of Kadabra had not interruption come to my aid. Fast and furious was the fighting as the nobles of Silensis Ol sprang, time and again, up the steps before the throne only to fall back before a sword hand that seemed to have gained a new wizardry from its experience with the cunning Solon. 2 were pressing me so closely that I could not turn when I heard a movement behind me, and noted that the sound of the battle anthem had ceased. Was Dejah Thoris preparing to take her place beside me? Heroic daughter of heroic world, it would not be unlike her to have seized a sword and fought at my side, for though the women of Mars are not trained in the arts of war, the spirit is theirs, and they have been known to do that very thing upon countless occasions. But she did not come, and glad I was, for it would have doubled my burden in protecting her before I should have been able to force her back again out of harm's way. She must be contemplating some cunning strategy, I thought, and so I fought on secure in the belief that my divine princess stood close behind me. For half an hour at least I must have fought there against the nobles of Okar, ere ever one placed a foot upon the dais where I stood, and then of a sudden all that remained of them formed below me for a last, mad, desperate charge. But even as they advanced, the door at the far end of the chamber swung wide, and a wild-eyed messenger sprang into the room. "The Jeddak of Jeddaks," he cried. "Where is the Jeddak of Jeddaks? This city has fallen before the hordes from beyond the barrier, and but now the great gate of the palace itself has been forced, and the warriors of the south are pouring into its sacred precincts. Where is Silensis Ol? He alone may revive the flagging courage of our warriors. He alone may save the day for Okar. Where is Silensis Ol?" The nobles stepped back from about the dead body of their ruler, and one of them pointed to the grinning corpse. The messenger staggered back in horror as though from a blow in the face. "Then fly, nobles of Okar," he cried, "for naught can save you. Hark, they come!" As he spoke we heard the deep roar of angry men from the corridor without, and the clank of metal and the clang of swords. Without another glance toward me, who had stood a spectator of the tragic scene, the nobles wheeled and fled from the apartment through another exit. Almost immediately a force of yellow warriors appeared in the doorway through which the messenger had come. They were backing toward the apartment, stubbornly resisting the advance of a handful of red men who faced them and forced them slowly but inevitably back. Above the heads of the contestants I could see from my elevated station upon the dais the face of my old friend Ch12. He was leading the little party that had won its way into the very heart of the palace of Silensis Ol. In an instant I saw that by attacking the Okarians from the rear I could so quickly disorganize them that their further resistance would be short-lived, and with this idea in mind I sprang from the dais, casting a word of explanation to Dejah Thoris over my shoulder, though I did not turn to look at her. With myself ever between her enemies and herself, and with Ch12 and his warriors winning to the apartment, there could be no danger to Dejah Thoris standing there alone beside the throne. I wanted the men of Helium to see me and to know that their beloved princess was here too, for I knew that this knowledge would inspire them to even greater deeds of valor than they had performed in the past, though great indeed must have been those which won for them a way into the almost impregnable palace of the tyrant of the north. As I crossed the chamber to attack the Cadaverans from the rear, a small doorway at my left opened, and to my surprise revealed the figures of Mata Shang, father of Therns, and Feodor, his daughter, peering into the room. A quick glance about they took. Their eyes rested for a moment wide in horror upon the dead body of Silensis Ol, upon the blood that crimsoned the floor, upon the corpse of the nobles who had fallen thick before the throne, upon me, and upon the battling warriors at the other door. They did not essay to enter the apartment, but scanned its every corner from where they stood, and then, when their eyes had sought its entire area, a look of fierce rage overspread the features of Mata Shang, and a cold and cunning smile touched the lips of Feodor. Then they were gone, but not before a taunting laugh was thrown directly in my face by the woman. I did not understand then the meaning of Mata Shang's rage or Feodor's pleasure, but I knew that neither boded good for me. A moment later I was upon the banks of the Yellow Men, and as the red men of Helium saw me above the shoulders of their antagonists, a great shout rang through the corridor, and for a moment drowned the noise of battle. "For the Prince of Helium!" they cried. "For the Prince of Helium!" And like hungry lions upon their prey, they fell once more upon the weakened warriors of the north. The Yellow Men, cornered between two enemies, fought with the desperation that utter hopelessness often induces. Fought as I should have fought had been in their stead, with the determination to take as many of my enemies with me when I died as lay within the power of my sword arm. It was a glorious battle, but the end seemed inevitable, when presently from down the corridor behind the red men came a great body of reinforcing yellow warriors. Now were the tables turned, and it was the men of Helium who seemed doomed to be ground between two millstones. All were compelled to turn to meet this new assault by a greatly superior force, so that to me was left the remnants of the yellow men within the throne room. They kept me busy, too, so busy that I began to wonder if indeed I should have ever been done with them. Slowly they pressed me back into the room, and when they had all passed in after me, one of them closed and bolted the door, effectually barring the way against the men of Ch12. It was a clever move, for it put me at the mercy of a dozen men within a chamber from which assistance was locked out, and it gave the red men in the corridor beyond no avenue of escape should their new antagonists press them too closely. But I have faced heavier odds myself than were pitted against me that day, and I knew that Ch12 had battled his way from 100 more dangerous traps than that in which he now was. So it was with no feelings of despair that I turned my attention to the business of the moment. Constantly my thoughts reverted to Dejah Thoris, and I longed for the moment when, the fighting done, I could fold her in my arms, and hear once more the words of love which had been denied me for so many years. During the fighting in the chamber, I had not even a single chance to so much as steal a glance at her, where she stood behind me, beside the throne of the dead ruler. I wondered why she no longer urged me on with the strains of the martial hymn of Helium. But I did not need more than the knowledge that I was battling for her to bring out the best that is in me. It would be wearisome to narrate the details of that bloody struggle, of how we fought from the doorway, the full length of the room to the very foot of the throne before the last of my antagonists fell with my blade piercing his heart. And then, with a glad cry, I turned with outstretched arms to seize my princess, and as my lips smothered hers to reap the reward that would be thrice ample payment for the bloody encounters through which I had passed for her dear sake from the South Pole to the North, the glad cry died, frozen upon my lips. My arms dropped limp and lifeless to my sides. As one who reels beneath the burden of a mortal wound, I staggered up the steps before the throne. Dejah Thoris was gone. End of chapter 14.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Warlords of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the south shores of Lake Superior.
Chapter 15. Rewards. With the realization that Dejah Thoris was no longer within the throne room, came the belated recollection of the dark face that I had glimpsed peering from behind the draperies that backed the throne of Silensis Ol, at the moment I had first come so unexpectedly upon the strange scene being enacted within the chamber. Why had the sight of that evil countenance not warned me to greater caution? Why had I permitted the rapid development of new situations to efface the recollection of that menacing danger? But, alas, vain regret would not erase the calamity that had befallen. Once again had Dejah Thoris fallen into the clutches of that arch-fiend, Thurid, the black tutor of the firstborn. Again was all my arduous labor gone for naught. Now I realized the cause of that rage that had been writ so large upon the features of Mata Shang, and the cruel pleasure that I had seen upon the face of Feodor. They had known or guessed the truth, and the Hecador of the holy Therns, who had evidently come to the chamber in the hope of thwarting Silensis Ol in his contemplated perfidy against the high priest who coveted Dejah Thoris for himself, realized that Thurid had stolen the prize from beneath his very nose. Feodor's pleasure had been due to her realization of what this last cruel blow would mean to me, as well as to a partial satisfaction of her jealous hatred for the Princess of Helium. My first thought was to look beyond the draperies at the back of the throne, for there it was that I had seen Thurid. With a single jerk I tore the priceless stuff from its fastenings, and there before me was revealed a narrow doorway behind the throne. No question entered my mind but that here lay the opening of the avenue of escape which Thurid had followed, and had there been, it would have been dissipated by the sight of a tiny, jeweled ornament which lay a few steps within the corridor beyond. As I snatched up the bauble, I saw that it bore the device of the Princess of Helium. Then, pressing it to my lips, I dashed madly along the winding way that led gently downward toward the lower galleries of the palace. I had followed but a short distance when I came upon the room in which Solon formerly had held sway. His dead body still lay where I had left it, nor was there any sign that another had passed through the room since I had been there, but I knew that two had done so, Thurid the Black Tutor and Dejah Thoris. For a moment I paused uncertain as to which of the several exits from the apartment would lead me upon the right path. I tried to recollect the directions which I had heard Thurid repeat to Solon, and at last, slowly, as though through a heavy fog, the memory of the words of the firstborn came to me. Follow a corridor passing 3 diverging corridors upon the right, then into the 4th right-hand corridor to where 3 corridors meet. Here again follow to the right, hugging the left wall closely to avoid the pit. At the end of this corridor I shall come to a spiral runway which I must follow down instead of up. After that the way is a long but a single branchless corridor, and I recalled the exit at which he had pointed as he spoke. It did not take me long to start upon that unknown way, nor did I go with caution, although I knew that there might be grave dangers before me. Part of the way was black as sin, but for the most it was fairly well lighted. The stretch where I must hug the left wall to avoid the pits was darkest of them all, and I was nearly over the edge of the abyss before I knew that I was near the danger spot. A narrow ledge, scarce a foot wide, was all that had been left to carry the initiated past that frightful cavity into which the unknowing must surely have toppled at the first step. But at last I had won safely beyond it. Then a feeble light made the balance of the way plain.
until, at the end of the last corridor, I came suddenly out into the glare of day upon a field of snow and ice. Clad for the warm atmosphere of the hothouse city of Cadabra, the sudden change to Arctic frigidity was anything but pleasant. But the worst of it was that I knew I could not endure the bitter cold, almost naked as I was, and that I would perish before ever I could overtake Thurid and Dejah Thoris. To be thus blocked by nature, who had had all the arts and wiles of cunning men pitted against him, seemed a cruel fate, and as I staggered back into the warmth of the tunnel's end, I was as near hopelessness as I ever have been. I had by no means given up my intention of continuing the pursuit, for if needs be I would go ahead, though I perished ere ever I reached my goal. But if there were a safer way, it were well worth the delay to attempt to discover it, that I might come again to the side of Dejah Thoris in fit condition to do battle for her. Scarce had I returned to the tunnel than I stumbled over a portion of a fur garment that seemed fastened to the floor of the corridor close to the wall. In the darkness I could not see what held it, but by groping with my hands I discovered that it was wedged beneath the bottom of a closed door. Pushing the portal aside, I found myself upon the threshold of a small chamber, the walls of which were lined with hooks, from which depended suits of the complete outdoor apparel of the yellow men. Situated as it was at the mouth of a tunnel leading from the palace, it was quite evident that this was the dressing-room used by the nobles leaving and entering the hothouse city, and that Thurid, having knowledge of it, had stopped here to outfit himself and Dejah Thoris before venturing into the bitter cold of the Arctic world beyond. In his haste he had dropped several garments upon the floor, and the telltale fur that had fallen partly within the corridor had proved the means of guiding me to the very spot he would least have wished me to have knowledge of. It required but the matter of a few seconds to don the necessary orlick skin clothing, with the heavy fur-lined boots that are so essential a part of the garmenture of one who would successfully contend with the frozen trails and the icy winds of the bleak Northland. Once more I stepped beyond the tunnel's mouth to find the fresh tracks of Thurid and Dejah Thoris in the new-fallen snow. Now, at last, was my task an easy one, for though the going was rough in the extreme, I was no longer vexed by doubts as to the direction I should follow, or harassed by darkness or hidden dangers. Through a snow-covered canyon the way led up toward the summit of the low hills. Beyond these is dipped again into another canyon, only to rise a quarter-mile further on toward a pass which skirted the flank of a rocky hill. I could see by the signs of those who had gone before that when Dejah Thoris had walked she had been continually holding back, and that the black man had been compelled to drag her. For other stretches only his footprints were visible, deep and close together in the heavy snow, and I knew from these signs that then he had been forced to carry her, and I could well imagine that she had fought him fiercely every step of the way. As I came round the jetting promontory of the hill's shoulder, I saw that which quickened my pulse, and set my heart to beating high, for within a tiny basin between the crest of this hill and the next stood 4 people before the mouth of a great cave, and beside them upon the gleaming snow rested a flyer which had evidently but just been dragged from its hiding-place. The 4 were Dejah Thoris, Feodor, Thurid, and Mata Shang. The 2 men were engaged in a heated argument, the father of Thurns threatening, while the black scoffed at him as he went about the work at which he was engaged. As I crept toward them cautiously, that I might come as near as possible before being discovered, I saw that finally the men appeared to have reached some sort of compromise, for with Feodor's assistance they both set about dragging the resisting Dejah Thoris to the flyer's deck. Here they made her fast, and then both again descended to the ground to complete the preparations for departure. Feodor entered the small cabin upon the vessel's deck. I had come to within a quarter of a mile of them when Mata Shang espied me. I saw him seize Thurid by the shoulder, wheeling him around in my direction as he pointed to where I was now plainly visible. For the moment that I knew I had been perceived, I cast aside every attempt at stealth, and broke into a mad race for the flyer. The 2 redoubled their efforts at the propeller at which they were working, and which very evidently was being replaced after having been removed for some purpose of repair. They had the thing completed before I had covered half the distance that lay between me and them, and then both made a rush for the boarding ladder.
Theward was the first to reach it, and with the agility of a monkey clambered swiftly to the boat's deck, where a touch of the button controlling the buoyancy tanks sent the craft slowly upward, though not with the speed that marks the well-conditioned flyer. I was still some 100 yards away as I saw them rising from my grasp. Back by the city of Cadabra lay a great fleet of mighty flyers, the ships of Helium and Parth that I had saved from destruction earlier in the day. But before ever I could reach them, Theward could easily make good his escape. As I ran, I saw Mata Shang clambering up the swaying, swinging ladder toward the deck, while above him leaned the evil face of the firstborn. A trailing rope from the vessel's stern put new hope in me, for if I could but reach it before it whipped too high above my head, there was yet a chance to gain the deck by its slender aid. That there was something radically wrong with the flyer was evident from its lack of buoyancy, and the further fact that though Theward had turned twice to the starting lever, the boat still hung motionless in the air, except for a slight drifting with a low breeze from the north. Now Mata Shang was close to the gunwale. A long, claw-like hand was reaching up to grasp the metal rail. Theward leaned further down toward his co-conspirator. Suddenly a raised dagger gleamed in the upflung hand of the black. Down it drove toward the white face of the father of Therns. With a loud shriek of fear, the holy Hecador grasped frantically at that menacing arm. I was almost to the trailing rope by now. The craft was still rising slowly, the while it drifted from me. Then I stumbled on the icy way, striking my head upon a rock as I fell, sprawling, but an arm's length from the rope, the end of which was now just leaving the ground. With the blow upon my head came unconsciousness. It could not have been more than a few seconds that I lay senseless there upon the northern ice, while all that was dearest to me drifted further from my reach in the clutches of that black fiend. For when I opened my eyes, Theward and Mata Shang yet battled at the ladder's top, and the flyer drifted but 100 yards further to the south. But the end of the trailing rope was now a good 30 feet above the ground. Goaded to madness by the cruel misfortune that had tripped me when success was almost within my grasp, I tore frantically across the intervening space, and just beneath the rope's dangling end I put my earthly muscles to the supreme test. With a mighty cat-like bound I sprang upward toward that slender strand, the only avenue which yet remained that could carry me to my vanishing love. A foot above its lowest end my fingers closed. Tightly as I clung, I felt the rope slipping through my grasp. I tried to raise my free hand to take a second hold above my first, but the change of position that resulted caused me to slip more rapidly toward the end of the rope. Slowly I felt the tantalizing thing escaping me. In a moment all that I had gained would be lost. Then my fingers reached a knot at the very end of the rope and slipped no more. With a prayer of gratitude upon my lips, I scrambled upward toward the boat's deck. I could not see Theward or Mata Shang now, but I heard the sounds of conflict, and thus knew that they still fought, the Thern for his life, and the black for the increased buoyancy that relief from the weight of even a single body would give the craft. Should Mata Shang die before I reached the deck, my chances of ever reaching it would be slender indeed, for the black Dator need but cut the rope above me to be freed from me forever. For the vessel had drifted across the brink of a chasm, into whose yawning depths my body would drop to be crushed to a shapeless pulp should Theward reach the rope now. At last my hand closed upon the ship's rail, and that very instant a horrid shriek rang out below me that sent my blood cold and turned my horrified eyes downward to a shrieking, hurtling, twisting thing that shot downward into the awful chasm beneath me. It was Mata Shang, holy Hecador, father of Therns, gone to his last accounting. Then my head came above the deck, and I saw Theward, dagger in hand, leaping toward me. He was opposite the forward end of the cabin, while I was attempting to clamber aboard near the vessel's stern. But a few paces lay between us. No power on earth could raise me to that deck before the infuriated black would be upon me. My end had come. I knew it. But had there been a doubt in my mind, the nasty leer of triumph upon that wicked face would have convinced me. Beyond Theward I could see my Dejah Thoris, wide-eyed and horrified, struggling at her bonds.
That she should be forced to witness my awful death made my bitter fate seem doubly cruel. I ceased my efforts to climb across the gunwale. Instead, I took a firm grasp upon the rail with my left hand and drew my dagger. I should at least die as I had lived, fighting. As Theward came opposite the cabin's doorway, a new element projected itself into the grim tragedy of the air that was being enacted upon the deck of Mata Shang's disabled flyer. It was Feodor. With flushed face and disheveled hair, and eyes that betrayed the recent presence of mortal tears above which this proud goddess had always held herself, she leaped to the deck directly before me. In her hand was a long, slim dagger. I cast a last look upon my beloved princess, smiling, as men should who are about to die. Then I turned my face up toward Feodor, waiting for the blow. Never have I seen that beautiful face more beautiful than it was at that moment. It seemed incredible that one so lovely could yet harbor within her fair bosom a heart so cruel and relentless, and today there was a new expression in her wondrous eyes that I never before had seen there, an unfamiliar softness, and a look of suffering. Theward was beside her now, pushing past to reach me first, and then what happened so quickly that it was all over before I could realize the truth of it. Feodor's slim hand shot out to close upon the black's dagger wrist. Her right hand went high with its gleaming blade. "That for Mata Shang," she cried, and she buried her blade deep in the Dator's breast. "That for the wrong you would have done Dejah Thoris," and again the sharp steel shank into the bloody flesh. "And that, and that, and that," she shrieked, "for John Carter, Prince of Helium." And with each word her sharp point pierced the vile heart of the great villain. Then, with a vindictive shove, she cast the carcass of the firstborn from the deck to fall in awful silence after the body of his victim. I had been so paralyzed by surprise that I had made no move to reach the deck during the awe-inspiring scene which I had just witnessed, and now I was to be still further amazed by her next act, for Feodor extended her hand to me and assisted me to the deck, where I stood gazing at her in unconcealed and stupefied wonderment. A wan smile touched her lips. It was not the cruel and haughty smile of the goddess with which I was familiar. "You wonder, John Carter," she said, "what strange thing has wrought this change in me. I will tell you. It is love, love of you." And when I darkened my brows in disapproval of her words, she raised an appealing hand. "Wait," she said. "It is a different love from mine. It is the love of your princess, Dejah Thoris, for you that has taught me what true love may be, what it should be, and how far from real love was my selfish and jealous passion for you. Now I am different. Now could I love as Dejah Thoris loves, and so my only happiness could be to know that you and she are once more united, for in her alone can you find true happiness. But I am unhappy because of the wickedness that I have wrought. I have many sins to expiate, and though I be deathless, life is all too short for the atonement. But there is another way, and if Feodor, daughter of the holy Hecador of the holy Therns, has sinned, she has this day already made partial reparation, and lest you doubt the sincerity of her protestation and her avowal of a new love that embraces Dejah Thoris also, she will prove her sincerity in the only way that lies open. Having saved you for another, Feodor leaves you to her embraces." With her last words she turned and leaped from the vessel's deck into the abyss below. With a cry of horror I sprang forward in a vain attempt to save the life that for 2 years I would so gladly have seen extinguished. I was too late. With tear-dimmed eyes I turned away that I might not see the awful sight beneath. A moment later I had struck the bonds from Dejah Thoris, and as her dear arms went about my neck and her perfect lips pressed to mine, I forgot the horrors that I had witnessed and the suffering that I had endured in the rapture of my reward. End of chapter 15.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Kara Schallenberg. Warlord of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 16. The New Ruler. The flyer, upon whose deck Dejah Thoris and I found ourselves after 12 long years of separation, proved entirely useless. Her buoyancy tanks leaked badly. Her engine would not start. We were helpless there in mid-air, above the Arctic ice. The craft had drifted across the chasm which held the corpses of Matai Shang, Thurid, and Fedor, and now hung above a low hill. Opening the buoyancy escape valves, I permitted her to come slowly to the frozen ground, and as she touched, Dejah Thoris and I stepped from her deck and, hand in hand, turned back across the frozen waste toward the city of Kadabra. Through the tunnel that had led me in pursuit of them we passed, walking slowly, for we had much to say to each other. She told me of that last terrible moment months before, when the door of her prison cell within the Temple of the Sun was slowly closing between us, of how Fedor had sprung upon her with uplifted dagger, and of Thuvia's shriek as she had realized the foul intention of the Thurn goddess. It had been that cry that had rung in my ears all the long weary months that I had been left in cruel doubt as to my princess's fate, for I had not known that Thuvia had wrested the blade from the daughter of Matai Shang before it had touched either Dejah Thoris or herself. She told me, too, of the awful eternity of her imprisonment, of the cruel hatred of Fedor and the tender love of Thuvia, and of how even when despair was the darkest, those two red girls had clung to the same hope and belief, that John Carter would find a way to release them. Presently we came to the chamber of Solon. I had been proceeding without thought of caution, for I was sure that the city and the palace were both in the hands of my friends by this time. And so it was that I bolted into the chamber full into the midst of a dozen nobles of the court of Silenus all. They were passing through on their way to the outside world along the corridors we had just traversed. At sight of us they halted in their tracks, and then an ugly smile overspread the features of their leader. "The author of all our misfortunes," he cried, pointing at me. "We shall have the satisfaction of a partial vengeance, at least, when we leave behind us here the dead and mutilated corpses of the Prince and Princess of Helium. When they find them," he went on, jerking his thumb upward toward the palace above, "they will realize that the vengeance of the Yellow Man costs his enemies dear. Prepare to die, John Carter, but that your end may be the more bitter, know that I may change my intention as to meeting a merciful death to your princess. Possibly she shall be preserved as a plaything for my nobles." I stood close to the instrument-covered wall, Dejah Thoris at my side. She looked up at me wonderingly as the warriors advanced upon us with drawn swords, for mine still hung within its scabbard at my side, and there was a smile upon my lips. The yellow nobles, too, looked in surprise, and then, as I made no move to draw, they hesitated, fearing a ruse, but their leader urged them on. When they had come almost within sword's reach of me, I raised my hand and laid it upon the polished surface of a great lever, and then, still smiling grimly, I looked my enemies full in the face. As one, they came to a sudden stop, casting affrighted glances at me and at one another. "Stop!" shrieked their leader. "You dream not what you do." "Right you are," I replied. "John Carter does not dream. He knows that should one of you take another step toward Dejah Thoris, Princess of Helium, I pull this lever wide, and she and I shall die together, but we shall not die alone." The nobles shrank back, whispering together for a few moments. At last their leader turned to me. "Go your way, John Carter," he said, "and we shall go ours." "Prisoners do not go their own way," I answered, "and you are prisoners, prisoners of the Prince of Helium." Before they could make answer, a door upon the opposite side of the apartment opened, and a score of yellow men poured into the apartment. For an instant the nobles looked relieved, and then as their eyes fell upon the leader of the new party their faces fell, for he was Talu, rebel prince of Marentina, and they knew that they could look for neither aid nor mercy at his hands. "Well done, John Carter," he cried. "You turn their own mighty power against them. Fortunate for Okkar is it that you were here to prevent their escape, for these be the greatest villains north of the ice barrier, and this one," pointing to the leader of the party, "would have made himself Jeddak of Jeddaks in the place of the dead Silensus All. Then indeed would we have had a more villainous ruler than the hated tyrant who fell before your sword." The Okkarian nobles now submitted to arrest, since nothing but death faced them should they resist, and, escorted by the warriors of Talu, we made our way to the great audience chamber that had been Silensus All's. Here was a vast concourse of warriors. Red men from Helium and Ptarth, yellow men of the north, rubbing elbows with the blacks of the firstborn who had come under my friend Xodar to help in the search for me and my princess. There were savage green warriors from the Dead Sea bottoms of the south, and a handful of white-skinned Therns who had renounced their religion and sworn allegiance to Xodar. There was Tardos Mors and Mors Kajak, and, tall and mighty in his gorgeous warrior trappings, Cathoris, my son. These three fell upon Dejah Thoris as we entered the apartment, and though the lives and training of royal Martians tend not toward vulgar demonstration, I thought that they would suffocate her with their embraces. And there were Tars Tarkas, Jeddak of Thark, and Kantos Khan, my old-time friends, and leaping and tearing at my harness, in the exuberance of his great love, was dear old Woola, frantic mad with happiness. Long and loud was the cheering that burst forth at sight of us. Deafening was the din of ringing metal as the veteran warriors of every Martian clime clashed their blades together on high, in token of success and victory. But as I passed among the throng of saluting nobles and warriors, Jeds and Jeddaks, my heart was still heavy, for there were two faces missing that I would have given much to have seen there. Thuva Din and Thuvia of Tarth were not to be found in the great chamber. I made inquiries concerning them among men of every nation, and at last from one of the yellow prisoners of war I learned that they had been apprehended by an officer of the palace as they sought to reach the Pit of Plenty, while I lay imprisoned there. I did not need to ask to know what had sent them thither. The courageous Jeddak and his loyal daughter. My informer said that they lay now in one of the many buried dungeons of the palace, where they had been placed pending a decision as to their fate by the tyrant of the north. A moment later, searching parties were scouring the ancient pile in search of them, and my cup of happiness was full when I saw them being escorted into the room by a cheering guard of honor. Thuvia's first act was to rush to the side of Dejah Thoris, and I needed no better proof of the love these two bore for each other than the sincerity with which they embraced. Looking down upon that crowded chamber stood the silent and empty throne of Okkar. Of all the strange scenes it must have witnessed since that long-dead age that had first seen a Jeddak of Jeddaks take his seat upon it, none might compare with that upon which it now looked down, and as I pondered the past and future of that long-buried race of black-bearded yellow men, I thought that I saw a brighter and more useful existence for them among the great family of friendly nations that now stretched from the South Pole almost to their very doors. 22 years before I had been cast, naked and a stranger, into this strange and savage world. The hand of every race and nation was raised in continual strife and warring against the men of every other land and color. Today, by the might of my sword and the loyalty of the friends my sword had made for me, black man and white, red man and green, rubbed shoulders in peace and good fellowship. All the nations of Barsoom were not yet as one, but a great stride forward toward that goal had been taken, and now if I could but cement the fierce yellow race into this solidarity of nations, I should feel that I had rounded out a great life work, and repaid to Mars at least a portion of the immense debt of gratitude I owed her for having given me my Dejah Thoris. And, as I thought, I saw but one way and a single man who could ensure the success of my hopes. As is ever the way with me, I acted then as I always act, without deliberation and without consultation. Those who do not like my plans and my ways of promoting them have always their swords at their sides wherewith to back up their disapproval, but now there seemed to be no dissenting voice, as, grasping Talu by the arm, I sprang to the throne that had once been Silensus All's. "Warriors of Barsoom," I cried, "Kadabra has fallen, and with her the hateful tyrant of the north, but the integrity of Okkar must be preserved. The red men are ruled by red Jedaks. The green warriors of the ancient seas acknowledge none but a green ruler. The firstborn of the South Pole take their law from black Xodar. Nor would it be to the interests of either yellow or red man were a red Jedak to sit upon the throne of Okkar. There be but one warrior best fitted for the ancient and mighty title of Jedaks of the North. Men of Okkar, raise your swords to your new ruler, Talu, the rebel prince of Marantina." And then a great cry of rejoicing rose among the free men of Marantina and the Kadabran prisoners, for all had thought that the red men would retain that which they had taken by force of arms, for such had been the way upon Barsoom, and that they should be ruled henceforth by an alien Jedak. The victorious warriors who had followed Thoris joined in the mad demonstration, and amidst the wild confusion and the tumult and the cheering, Dejah Thoris and I passed out into the gorgeous garden of the Jedaks that graces the inner courtyard of the palace of Kadabra. At our heels walked Wula, and upon a carved seat of wondrous beauty beneath a bower of purple blooms we saw two who had preceded us, Thuvia of Ptarth and Thoris of Helium. The handsome head of the handsome youth was bent low above the beautiful face of his companion. I looked at Dejah Thoris, smiling, and as I drew her close to me I whispered, "Why not?" Indeed, why not? What matter ages in this world of perpetual youth? We remained at Kadabra, the guests of Talu, until after his formal induction into office, and then, upon the great fleet which I had been so fortunate to preserve from destruction, we sailed south across the ice barrier, but not before we had witnessed the total demolition of the grim guardian of the north under orders of the new Jedak of Jedaks. "Henceforth," he said as the work was completed, "the fleets of the red men and the black are free to come and go across the ice barrier as over their own lands. The carrion caves shall be cleansed, that the green men may find an easy way to the land of the yellow, and the hunting of the sacred apt shall be the sport of my nobles until no single specimen of that hideous creature roams the frozen north." We bade our yellow friends farewell with real regret as we set sail for Ptarth. There we remained, the guest of Thuv and Din, for a month, and I could see that Thoris would have remained forever had he not been a prince of Helium. Above the mighty forests of Chaol we hovered until word from Kulan Tith brought us to his single landing tower, where all day and half a night the vessels disembarked their crews. At the city of Chaol we visited, cementing the new ties that had been formed between Chaol and Helium, and then one long-to-be-remembered day we sighted the tall, thin towers of the twin cities of Helium. The people had long been preparing for our coming. The sky was gorgeous with gaily trimmed flyers. Every roof within both cities was spread with costly silks and tapestries. Gold and jewels were scattered over roof and street and plaza, so that the two cities seemed ablaze with the fires of the hearts of the magnificent stones and burnished metal that reflected the brilliant sunlight, changing it into countless glorious hues. At last, after 12 years, the royal family of Helium was reunited in their own mighty city, surrounded by joy-mad millions before the palace gates. Women and children and mighty warriors wept in gratitude for the fate that had restored their beloved Tardos Mors and the divine princess whom the whole nation idolized. Nor did any of us who had been upon that expedition of indescribable danger and glory lack for plaudits. That night a messenger came to me as I sat with Dejah Thoris and Thoris upon the roof of my city palace, where we had long since caused a lovely garden to be made, that we three might find seclusion and quiet happiness among ourselves, far from the pomp and ceremony of court, to summon us to the Temple of Reward, where one is to be judged this night, the summons concluded. I racked my brain to try and determine what important case there might be pending which could call the royal family from their palaces on the eve of their return to Helium after years of absence, but when the Jedak summons, no man delays. As our flyer touched the landing stage at the temple's top, we saw countless other craft arriving and departing. In the streets below, a great multitude surged toward the great gates of the temple. Slowly there came to me the recollection of the deferred doom that awaited me since that time I had been tried here in the temple by Ch16 for the sin of returning from the Valley d'Or and the lost sea of Chorus. Could it be possible that the strict sense of justice which dominates the men of Mars had caused them to overlook the great good that had come out of my heresy? Could they ignore the fact that to me and me alone was due the rescue of Thoris, of Dejah Thoris, of Mors Kajak, of Tardos Mors? I could not believe it, and yet for what other purpose could I have been summoned to the Temple of Reward immediately upon the return of Tardos Mors to his throne? My first surprise as I entered the temple and approached the throne of righteousness was to note the men who sat there as judges. There was Kulan Tith, Jeddak of Keal, whom we had but just left within his own palace a few days since. There was Thuvan Din, Jeddak of Ptarth. How came he to Helium as soon as we? There was Tars Tarkas, Jeddak of Thark, and Xodar, Jeddak of the Firstborn. There was Talu, Jeddak of Jeddaks of the North, whom I could have sworn was still in his ice-bound hothouse city beyond the northern barrier, and among them sat Tardos Mors and Mors Kajak, with enough lesser Jeds and Jeddaks to make up the 31 who must sit in judgment upon their fellow man. A right royal tribunal indeed, and such a one, I warrant, as never before sat together during all the history of ancient Mars. As I entered, silence fell upon the great concourse of people that packed the auditorium. Then Tardos Mors arose. "John Carter," he said in his deep martial voice, "take your place upon the pedestal of truth, for you are to be tried by a fair and impartial tribunal of your fellow men." With level eye and high-held head I did as he bade, and as soon as I glanced about that circle of faces that a moment before I could have sworn contained the best friends I had upon Barsoom, I saw no single friendly glance, only stern, uncompromising judges, there to do their duty. A clerk rose, and from a great book read a long list of the more notable deeds that I had thought to my credit, covering a long period of 22 years, since first I had stepped the ochre sea bottom beside the incubator of the Tharks. With the others he read of all that I had done within the circle of the Ots Mountains, where the holy Therns and the Firstborn had held sway. It is the way upon Barsoom to recite a man's virtues with his sins when he is come to trial, and so I was not surprised that all that was to my credit should be read there to my judges, who knew it all by heart, even down to the present moment. When the reading had ceased, Tardos Mors arose. "Most righteous judges," he exclaimed, "you have heard recited all that is known of John Carter, Prince of Helium, the good with the bad. What is your judgment?" Then Tars Tarkas came slowly to his feet, unfolding all his mighty towering height until he loomed, a green bronze statue, far above us all. He turned a baleful eye upon me, he, Tars Tarkas, with whom I had fought through countless battles, whom I loved as a brother. I could have wept had I not been so mad with rage that I almost whipped my sword out and had at them all upon the spot. "Judges," he said, "there can be but one verdict. No longer may John Carter be Prince of Helium." He paused. "But instead, let him be Jeddak of Jeddaks, Warlord of Barsoom." As the 31 judges sprang to their feet with drawn and upraised swords in unanimous concurrence in the verdict, the storm broke throughout the length and breadth and height of that mighty building until I thought the roof would fall from the thunder of the mad shouting. Now at last I saw the grim humor of the method they had adopted to do me this great honor, but that there was any hoax in the reality of the title they had conferred upon me was readily disproved by the sincerity of the congratulations that were heaped upon me by the judges first, and then the nobles. Presently 50 of the mightiest nobles of the greatest courts of Mars marched down the broad Isle of Hope, bearing a splendid car upon their shoulders, and as the people saw who sat within, the cheers that had rung out for me paled into insignificance beside those which thundered through the vast edifice now, For she whom the nobles carried was Dejah Thoris, beloved Princess of Helium. Straight to the throne of righteousness they bore her, and there Tardos Mors assisted her from the car, leading her forward to my side. "Let a world's most beautiful woman share the honor of her husband," he said. Before them all, I drew my wife close to me and kissed her upon the lips. End of Chapter 16, and the end of Warlord of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain.